Yeah, thank you, Constanze, for the introduction of myself. That was very kind. Good to be here. It's nice to speak in front of some known faces. I recently bought this backpack by a very well-known brand called Fjellraven. You may have seen it a lot among students. And it's very good. I like it because it's very high quality. Fjellraven has not made cheap stuff. And it has these buttons here on the side where you can see it, and also here. And when you open it, there's a name on it. You might not be able to see it, but I made a photo. And when you look at this, you can see that there is the name Prim inside. Here, Prim. You might be tempted to spell it Prüm, but it's Prim. And Prim was, or still is, a company that sells all different kinds of metal products, from pins and needles to buttons and the different stuff. They are a major supplier for the cloth industry. And they actually go very far back in time, back to 1580, as they say. Here's an old blister pack of these buttons. And these buttons were very important for their history as a company, known under the name Prim's Zukunft, so Prim's future. Back then, in the 16th century, when the company was founded, they were one of several of the so-called Kupfermeister families. There are different companies that still partly exist today, like as Prim, but also a Pelzer Works. And you may also know here in the Ruhr district, the Hösch AG, which was just taken over by Krupp in 1992, which was then transformed to ThyssenKrupp just lately. And Stolberg is here, so very close to Aachen in the border area to Belgium and the Netherlands. The general influence of the Kupfermeister families on the process of industrialization is well known, and they had a vast network of contacts. So, for example, Jacob de Buret made the brass production in Britain very popular. And also the Momma family, they had business in northern Sweden, which is today Kiruna. So they had a vast contact of networks, and they kept to themselves through intermarriages and forming a kind of, yeah, let's say copper syndicate, and which made anyone who was not part of these families very hard to produce brass. So an outsider could not compete with them. They lived in prestigious houses, so this is the Kupferhof Rosenthal in Stolberg, and had the kings and queens of Europe as their guests. And one anonymous visitor in 720 left a note asking himself, where in God's name do these lords of copper get their wealth from? Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it was Karl Marx's idea that the emergence of capitalism was not a peaceful nor benign process, began by forcibly taking land away from people or taking people away from their land, forcing them to survive by providing cheap labor for business owned by other people. This theory was come to be known as the primitive accumulation. It was largely underdeveloped at that time, but from that theory, Eric Williams, the later first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, made his thesis, and where he thought that the capital used to finance the Industrial Revolution was acquired through the transatlantic economies. And by that, William meant that manufactured goods were produced here in Europe, then sent to West Africa in order to buy slaves. These slaves were then shipped to the Caribbean and also to Brazil to produce sugar, cotton, and tobacco, and also rum and others on the plantations. And these products were then brought back to Europe. And Williams thought that through the sale of these products made by slave labor, a surplus capital was gained that was then used to finance the Industrial Revolution. So Williams had three main theses from his PhD, which was published in 1944 under the name Capitalism and Slavery. First one was that the slaving plantation complex fueled the Industrial Revolution. In Britain, slavery was not born of racism, rather racism was the consequence of slavery, and slavery was abolished for economic rather than humanitarian reasons. It was maybe the last one that got him in quite some trouble. In an effort to publish his Capitalism and Slavery in Britain, he approached Frederick Warburg, so that is the publisher of Animal Farm in 1984. But Warburg thought that William's argument that the British supported the abolition of slavery for economic rather than humanitarian reasons ran contrary to the British tradition, adding, "I would never publish such a book." So it took until 1964 when Williams was able to publish his book there. Criticism came also in 1977 when Simon Drescher published his book Econocide, British Slavery in the Era of Abolition. And there Drescher showed that the slaving plantation system was still economic at the time of abolition, refuting Williams' third argument. So this has sparked general skepticism towards Williams' capitalism and slavery as a whole. Critics called Williams obsessed with economic determinism, his arguments about the abolition being cynical and reductionist. So these two arguments are somewhat criticized, but the first one still remains, and few doubt any longer that the connection exists between slavery, industrialization, and capitalism. But what is currently at stake is how wide and dense this relationship is, and where its causal directionals can be found. It's just a sign of our time, of our zeitgeist, that in 2022, capitalism and slavery became a penguin modern classic. In 1997, Robin Blackburn came up with The Making of New World Slavery, and while Williams focused largely on the British economy, using more kind of an actor network approach, Robin Blackburn extends Williams' arguments in his 1997 book, The Making of New World Slavery. For Blackburn, slavery not only enabled European capitalism, but also the entire wealth of European modernity itself. Blackburn shows that beginning in the era of pre-industrial mercantile capitalism, it was not Britain, but continental and even Central Europe where robust consumer markets for the exotic plantation products emerged. Blackburn supposed that it were these markets which in turn generated capital that funded the Industrial Revolution, placing Central Europe at the core of the Atlantic network. Speaking about core and peripheries, according to world system theory, core areas are characterized by dominance in productivity, trade, and finance, while periphery areas and semi-peripheral territories are economically dependent on and influenced by these core regions. So based on this line of thought, Central Europe has long been overlooked in its influence on colonial trade, production, and consumption, and thus the formation of the early modern capital. And it took until 2004 when Klaus Weber came up with his pioneering PhD thesis, Deutsche Kaufleute im Atlantikhandel, so German merchants in Atlantic trade. And Klaus Weber was able to show the vital role that both merchants and goods produced from the German-speaking world for the development of the slaving plantation system had. This made the common view that Germany was not involved in the slave trade or the European expansion in general unsustainable. Weber's students published so interesting books like Slavery Hinterland and also the Globalized Peripheries, where they all talk about the role of different goods and merchants and the connections to the transatlantic trade. So instead of assuming that core actors of the European sea powers like Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and so on, solely dominated practices of trade, production, and consumption, we must consider the possibility that seemingly peripheral actors could set the terms. Which brings us back to our Kupfermeister, where we also must consider the very real possibility that the wealth of the Kupfermeister stems from the transatlantic economies, although up to now, there is no evidence for this. Don't get me wrong, the history of these copper producing families is well known. There's a lot of publications about them, but none of this publication connects their wealth to the transatlantic economies. So let's first look what was produced for these markets, what was used on these markets, and then later if the Kupfermeister families were able to produce this. On the West African trade, barter goods made of iron, copper, and copper alloys, such as brass, were used. And on the Caribbean market, copper instruments at the sugar works, at the boiling and steel houses, were needed. At those houses, the boiling and steel houses, there was an enormous amount of copper used. So everything that you can see here is copper. And these boilers, copper boilers, were quite big. So they were 2,700 liters. Modern bathtub is only 300 liters. So they were 9 times the size of a modern bathtub. And these houses were quite common. You can also see here, it's all made of copper, everything what you see there. And on the West African markets, there was the need for basins, pots, pans, containers, known under the name hollowware, made of copper or brass. And also these so-called guinea rods, thick wire made of copper or brass. And last but not least, these open horseshoe-shaped rings, so-called manillas, made of various metal. Can be copper, can be iron, can be brass. The thing is that the Kupfermeister would have been able to produce the materials for both the plantations and the Americas and the African market, but rods and hollowware was also needed on the European markets. So a connection to the transatlantic markets cannot be established simply through comparing the products. They were able to produce these products, but as you can see here, that's nothing special. That was also needed in Europe in huge demands. There is, however, something odd on how the Kupfermeister worked, because in 1562, the Prince of the Duchy of Jülich, which Stolberg is a part of, complained to the emperor that the council had forbidden to buy copperware which is prepared in his principality and lands. And the emperor replied that he would allow that people buy copper in these lands at Stolberg, but not if the copper is produced using these water-powered hammers, so-called trip hammers. It was believed that the quality produced by these hammers is inferior to the one produced by hand, because they thought that they could not control how thin the copper or brass would become. So the emperor says, send this material to Antwerp, what is Antwerp, and not in our lands. We do not want this here, it's not good quality, so send this away, please. But Antwerp was the global metal hub of the early modern era. So from there on, it could go anywhere. Could go to the US, could go to West Africa, could go to India. We don't know, but it's a little bit strange. So let's stick to this West African market for a moment, because this is something where I can say already something about. And let's focus for a moment on these manillas, because the thing is with the manillas, they had no purpose in European societies. Those other two objects were used in Europe too, but these ones, whoever produced these ones, is entangled to the transatlantic economies, without doubt. They were a product only made for the African trade. What is known about the manillas from the written sources? Manillas were used as a barter goods for purchasing slaves, gold, ivory, palm oil, and spices all along the West African coast. They were made of copper or brass. They also acted as a currency among West African ethnicities, being in use in Nigeria until 1948. They are said to have been produced in tons by 19th century companies in Bristol and Birmingham, and also Swansea in Wales. There is also a publication by Jakob Strieder with a very unlucky title, Strieder thought that manillas were largely made in Germany and were used in Africa as a raw material source for the creation of the Benin bronzes. In fact, they are sometimes depicted on the Benin bronzes themselves. Strieder had this idea from a document from Antwerp, from a notary archive in Antwerp, which describes a contract between the Augsburg Company of the Fugger and the Portuguese king dating back to 1548. In this document, the Fugger commit to supply 6,750 quintales manillas de letan fusalera, so this is cast brass, and 40,000 brass basins, pans, and cooking pots in 3 years. And the contract is so detailed that you can calculate how many manillas they would have had to produce in order to match this timeline in 3 years. So they had to produce every day 1,317 pieces. And this is something what the Fugger would not be able to, because they had no business with brass. The Fugger had business with copper, but only because they were interested in silver, and there was a technique of desilvering Alpine and Slovakian copper here in their plants in Slovakia and also in the Tyrol. And through desilvering, they got the silver out. But once the silver came in the mid-16th century from the New World, they were not interested anymore in the copper and sold everything. Götz von Pöllnitz, the Fugger chronicler, who has worked for many decades in the Fugger archive in Dillingen near Augsburg, said that the brass rings from these contacts were made in Hungary and also in Thuringia, probably referring to the Fugger's desilvering plant at Hohenkirchen and their mining enterprise in Slovakia. But it's unlikely that they were able to produce this. There is no indication that such a big facility has ever existed to produce these high amounts. They had them made somewhere, but it is never said, no document where that was. The only archaeological evidence for the making of the manillas is one single casting mold that was found in a foundry in Exeter in Cornwall, dating prior to 1625. Later in the 18th century, we know that there was a mass production of manillas in Bristol, Birmingham, and Wales, and thus leading scholars to believe that the manillas were made in the UK from the beginning of that African trade. A very nice, let's say, smoking gun was delivered at the beginning of this year by Hugo Solé of the University of Antwerp. He has shown that in the first half of the 16th century, a guy called Erasmus Schetz, a citizen of Aachen and a trader at Antwerp, supplied the Portuguese with approximately 300 tons of brass rings and brass basins each year. So it is said that Schetz had them made in Aachen. But what is interesting about this guy is how he worked, because in 1540, he also buys Engenho dos Erasmus, one of the earliest sugar plantations in Brazil. So he is not a copper master, he has no interest in producing copper, and by chance he can sell his ware on the African market. He produces the brass because he is in this transatlantic system. He knows it's a kind of currency in West Africa, and so he produces it, but he has nothing to do with the material. His descendants became important politicians in Belgium and still are until today, but under a different name. Then there were some problems in Central European copper mining, as you can see here. And that caused both the Fugger and the Schetz and many more to leave the metal industry. A new copper and brass industry was then built in Sweden and afterwards in Britain, with the influence of the Kupfermeister families, what we have seen in the beginning. It is vital to know who produced the manillas in this time period. We have seen these two families here, the Fugger and Schetz, but until then there was little slave trade. The slave trade continued in the 16th and 17th century, and also the amount of manillas that had to pay for one slave rose during that time. So it's vital to know, but there seems to be a kind of knowledge vacuum about the trade. Eugenia Herbert, who wrote this Red Gold of Africa, calculates an estimated amount of at least 50,000 tons of brass produced for the West African trade in the British period. So in the time from 1750 to 1850. Herbert also notes that if contemporary Dutch and Portuguese sources are true, we had to much more than double these figures. So that must have been an enormous impact on the economy. And these 50,000 tons, if you only take those 50,000 tons that are known from documents from custom houses, that would be equivalent to 100 millions of those rods, 300 millions of those manillas, and 20 million large containers. So that is enormous. What else do we know about the written sources, or from the written sources? In 2017, Rolf Denk, a professor of dermatology, so not an archaeologist, not a historian, published this monograph, The Manila Money of West Africa. And he went through, in a period of 50 years, through all existing literature in Portuguese, Spanish, French, Dutch, British, Danish, Swedish, and German literature. It was incredible work that he did, in search of where the manillas have been made, by whom, and to what extent. But the information available is extraordinarily scarce prior to the mid-18th century. It's only said that manillas are said to have come from Flanders, later Amsterdam, and London. So this guy, he is obsessed with the manillas and who made them. And he wrote me an email once that he is shocked and he cannot sleep at night because he cannot find any indication who made these manillas. We have these manillas also in the Western museums. A lot of material also here next door. But the thing with these materials is that we have no information on them. They have all different kinds of forms, and everything that is in the museum came in 1948, when the British authorities introduced paper money in Nigeria. There was an exchanging operation, and this way 32 million of this kind alone were brought back to Europe, and most of them ended up as scrap metal in the modern founders. So also in Arubis, which was then called Norddeutsche Affinerie in Hamburg. Private collectors, such as Hans-Joachim Runge, had somehow access to the delivery and chose the best looking pieces for their collections. But unfortunately, those were not the manillas that were produced in Europe for the trade, but other rings that were made by several indigenous ethnicities along West Africa. Rolf Denk tried to make up a typology of manillas by looking at the way they are depicted on the plaques. So from this, he thought that this is an early kind of manila used by the Portuguese and later by the Dutch. Then this is a French manila, and this is a so-called British Birmingham manila. It's just what he thought. But if you search in museum collections for these types, if you are lucky, you find one or two of this kind. There's also one here in the Berkeley Museum. But the other ones you will not find anymore. It's a pity that we do not have them, because if we would, we could apply the methods from archaeometallurgy that we have on them and would then find out where they were made. Because lead isotope analysis is a method adopted from geoscience, where it is used to assign a geological age to a certain rock. In archaeometallurgy, the method was kind of stolen and is used to investigate the provenance of metal artifacts. Lead isotope ratios of artifacts are compared with those of an ore deposit, and this is seen as valid as lead isotope ratios do not change when ore is transformed to metal. The thing is that Central European occurrences are mostly associated with the Variscan orogeny and thus largely overlap. So sometimes it's a problem if you have an artifact and you want to know where it is from. You cannot differentiate between different sources. But then on the other hand, sometimes you have something like copper from Sweden, which is very, very old and plots here in the diagram. So you can distinguish between copper from Sweden and copper from Central Europe in any case. It is but that the significance of the method is debatable. Problems in the interpretation of the data can arise, of course, when there is recycling or mixing of certain methods. Because what you get then, I had this once during my PhD when I analyzed these brass sheets, that would plot here because they were made from copper from Sweden and calamine, so the lead zinc source, here from Central Europe, and would plot here. But it's not significant. You cannot say from where it is made, but you can say maybe it's a mixture of those two sources when a source in Europe does not exist here. So it's kind of complicated, but sometimes it works and sometimes not. When we do not have the manillas for analysis, we might go to the Benin bronzes because we have them, or we had them, because it was already suspected that the manillas are thought to be a source of raw material for the creation of the Benin bronzes. And as we have seen, the lead isotopes do not fractionate from ore to metal, and also not when you cast the metal for anew. The lead isotope ratios of the Benin bronzes may point to the origin of the manillas and then to the origin of who has made the manillas. The thing is but not so easy. The Benin bronzes are not homogeneous in their chemical composition. Some are brass, others are leaded brass. A significant amount are a mixture of brass and bronze, and only a few are indeed bronze. So it's rather Benin brass than Benin bronze. And the lead isotope ratios of the Benin bronzes might represent a mixture of several sources, and is thus not easy to interpret. So if you have something like this here, you already can see that this might represent a mixture of brass and bronze. So something was put together, and then you get the lead isotope ratio that you cannot interpret. The other problem is that there is no related data set for the Benin bronzes. So those who have lead isotope ratios were not the ones chosen for chemical analysis. There is no existing data set that has chemistry and isotopy for the same objects. We are waiting for the results of Ernst Bernitzka, and he has a PhD student working on a private collection in Wien, but it's not published. So we have to work with what we have. And it is vital to know, does the lead isotope data represent a high lead source? And so we have to not look at the copper sources, but maybe rather at the lead occurrences. Or is the LO high in both zinc and tin, indicating a mixture of brass and maybe scrap bronze? Because bronze was already made in West Africa before the Portuguese arrived. There are objects dating back to the 9th century AD found to be made of local occurrences. This was done by Craddock. So it is likely that for the creation of the Benin bronzes that they are not solely made from new arriving material, but also made from existing bronze or brass. However, the Benin bronzes do not have any similarity with the widely traded copper of the Nyeri basin in Congo, so these objects here, nor the artifacts made from these copper occurrences. So that is easy to see that the ores from the Congo are similar to the objects here that were made. But the Benin material is quite different. It has more similarity with the Central European ores. But as I said, it's difficult to interpret the data, especially considering the possibilities of mixing and recycling. So the Benin bronzes are not a suitable proxy for judging on the provenance of the manillas. As Paul Craddock has put it, there is no evidence that the Manillas really did find their way into the Edo-Castus crucibles, nor do we know what they were actually made of. So there is no way around. We have to find the Manillas somewhere, but we don't have them. The only location where you can still find the Manillas is in the context of shipwrecks. So shipwrecks that were, ships that were wrecked anywhere on the triangular route between Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. Shipwrecks that can be dated with the use of dendrochronology or other methods when you have documents, or maybe you have stamps on cannons. So shipwrecks that can be dated, and this would be a possibility to get to the Manillas. And this is what I did. So I went through all these different shipwrecks that were found anywhere on the route. There are also 3 land finds here in West Africa from archaeological excavation, going from here to there, then to the Caribbean and back. And we went there, or I went there, and took material from the Manillas, from these shipwrecks, approximately 0.5 gram of fresh metal, and brought it back to Bochum, to the lab, where it was analyzed for trace elemental composition and lead isotope ratios. The Manillas that we found on these shipwrecks look like this. So they have nothing to do with the objects that are here in the museums everywhere. So that has to be changed also here in the Backroom Museum. You can see they are quite, they look all the same. It's a little bit different when you go to the later types, but the early types all look like this. The ends here are a bit thicker, and you really have to see hundreds of them in order to distinguish between the typology. So this is a bit complicated. So the chemistry of these Manillas, the early so-called Tacoais type, Denk has called them Tacoais Manillas, is leaded brass. So it contains up to 13% lead, plots anywhere here in the diagram. The intermediary Poco Manillas are brass or leaded copper with a few percent of zinc. And the later type, the so-called Birmingham Manillas, are mostly leaded copper with high amounts of lead. So this alloy is different from the Benin bronzes. Those Manillas won't have anything to do with the Benin bronzes, as we can also see here. All of these Birmingham Manillas lie outside the main cluster. But what is interesting is that the isotopes of these Tacoais Manillas plot all in this area where these green squares are, and these green squares are the ores of our Rhineland, the region between Aachen and Cologne. The Poco Manillas and the Birmingham Manillas plots outside this cluster. They have more similarities with occurrences in Wales and also in Silesia. Yeah, this is the Tacoais Manillas. They plot with the Rhenish ores. These are the later Manillas from 1700 onwards. They don't have anything to do with the Rhenish material. And if we compare now the data from the Benin bronzes with the Manillas, we can see that the early Manillas, so these Tacoais type that had similarities with the Rhenish ores, plot together with the main cluster, also visible here. I think there was a problem here with 2007 PB. The earlier measurements were done on a different mass spectrometer, so maybe there was a problem here, because here you can see it better. Yeah, here is the main cluster, and all of the early Manillas plot here, all of the later Manillas plot outside. So the lead isotope ratios of the Benin bronzes have more similarities with those of the early Manillas. Poco and Birmingham Manillas are outside the main cluster. Let's now look into the data a bit more, and we look at who, at where in the Rhineland they could have been produced. So we zoom in, we split this out, and then we see that the early manillas have similarity with the occurrences of calamine, so that is the lead zinc ore, at Aachen and Stolberg. So this must maybe go here. As I said, that is a little bit of older data, but still works. The early manillas have less similarity with the other occurrences like Mechanich, Reichheit, Bleialf, and so on. They are a product of these occurrences. That is the lead zinc ore that was used to make them, and it was operated by the Kupfermeister. Okay, that was a lot. So probably since the late 15th century, maybe even earlier, there has been a steady supply of brassware from the Rhineland. And while the actors trading with brass changed over time, the raw materials remained the same. And both the hinterland trade and the production of brass was carried out by Germans. There was a constant demand of brassware for the African trade, and this resulted in an early economy of scale using water-powered devices such as the trip hammers. Remember the document that we have seen, and the ware being produced seen as inferior to the hand-beaten brass and thus allowed for export only. So satisfying this steadily growing African demand may, I'm not saying it was, but I say may have eventually given the Kupfermeister surplus capital, allowing them to stay in the business and to grow to the large modern enterprises partly still existing today. So what do we make of this now? It's complicated, and I think Eric Williams would have liked that. So is this just another case of capitalism, industrialization, and slavery? The way that the Kupfermeister worked, so this is a very nice picture, the only picture that we have from these trip hammers. You can see, I think we all agree on this, the way that they worked was already a kind of industrialization. It has an industrial character because they had a centralized production at the Kupferhof, so where they worked. It is mass production of these objects. It was labor division. And there was not only the ones who hammered this, but also the ones who cast the brass and so on. It was monotone work. All of these men will be, I think, have problems with their ears later on, because it was very loud in these hammers. We see, as Marx would say, the formation of an early proletariat and also the Kupfermeister as an early capitalist or bourgeoisie, if you want. But if there is one takeaway message from what this connection may be, is it is something that Peter Kriete, Hans Medig, and Jürgen Schlumbohm have called industrialization before industrialization. So in all of these discussions that we have, the Williams thesis is always only connected to the 18th and 19th century. So what we have done here allows us to go far beyond that. And this is a very interesting point, because the 18th and 19th century is the period mostly addressed in this debates. But I want to also say something on the semantics question here, because this is important, very important here. So we have to ask ourselves, are the current scholarly conceptualizations of slavery and capitalism even productive frameworks to begin with? These are just two words. Do our thoughts about slavery and capitalism simply blur the underlying realities behind them? Do we construct two discrete categories where none might actually exist? But if there are these two categories, then what, in fact, is the relationship between a more compartmentalized notion of slavery and capitalism? And what kinds of assumptions are we consciously missing by framing the question in a way that asserts the separateness to begin with? Let's not talk about that now. We can discuss maybe later, but I think everyone has to ask this question. It's important. Okay, I want to close this talk now and tell you a story that has happened to me, which is very interesting. I was invited to Stolberg in June. Yeah, they they made a very nice poster for me, so I can feel like a rock star. Yeah? It was very nice, and I had a talk at the Knights Hall here. Yeah, that was very nice. And they did nice work with that. They have this Europa Nostra, and they were very interested. And I told them everything about the isotopes and everything that pretty much what I talked about here today. And yeah, a bit more for the public. And then at the end, I got a question, and they asked me, what do you think you have proven with that? You have shown that the raw material is from our area. You have not demonstrated that we or our ancestors here really produced the metal here. We could do an ingot, ship the ingot to the Netherlands or to Portugal and have nothing to do with the production of manillas. You cannot prove it. And if you cannot prove it, don't say it. So I'm not joking. They really said, don't insult our ancestors here. They were decent people. So why are you saying that? Why are you so on the witch hunt to do them harm and say they're bad? And while this is valid, the question everyone has to ask it, who works with isotope and everything, every time is an argument that you can bring up. But what is more interesting is who has asked this question. And the one who has asked this question was a descendant of this Kupfermeister. And from that moment on, I thought about this in a different direction. I'm not going to read the slide. You can read it as I think it says for itself. Why are we in Germany especially always like this? Why don't we trust the things? Why is our cultural memory always so turning to Second World War, and everything that was earlier is not discussed? Why is this the case? It's not okay to be like that. And it's okay to say, yeah, well, why do you insult my ancestors? You cannot prove it. It's okay. But transfer this to German society and think everyone would think like that. Everyone would say, oh, well, I'm skeptical. I don't believe in that. Because there's still people who suffer from that and who feel that all of that was injustice, and they still suffer from it. We are reminded about that in the recent time. But still, when we as a society say, yeah, well, I have nothing to do, you cannot prove it, and everything like that, and they need it black on white, which they got here. If something like that happens, then we have to think about in a different direction. We as Germans have something that Jürgen Zimmer has called the colonial amnesia. So we do not think far enough. We have a globalized world, but we don't understand our part in it. We are skeptical about it. And Klaus Weber called this once a flourishing trade, then gladly forgotten. So, but we want to do something, right? We want to do something. And by giving back the Benin bronzes, we say that we want to heal a wound. I'm just asking, how can we do that? How are we supposed to do that when we have not even begun to understand the damage that we have caused? All right, thank you.